Seth Collier was flat on his back on wet gravel, the Clearwater River roaring behind him, and 40 feet away, a full-grown mother bear stood at the tree line, staring at him with eyes that made no sense. His radio was gone. His legs wouldn't move. Behind him, the cub he'd just pulled from the current crawled toward its mother, coughing river water, dripping and alive. She took one silent step forward, then another. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. He had 38-degree air on his skin and 40 feet of ground between him and something that could kill him without breaking a sweat. And he was doing the only thing they teach you at the academy that nobody ever really believes will save your life. He was staying still. He was making himself smaller than the moment. He was letting the wild decide. Seth was 34 years old, a state game warden with a 9-year-old daughter named Emma and a wife named Rachel, who told him every single morning to be careful and every single evening not to bring work home into the kitchen. He had a mortgage on a small green house on Bramble Street in the town of Rockridge, Montana, and he had a pickup with 180,000 miles on it and a habit of humming when he was scared. He wasn't humming now. The cub reached its mother. She lowered her nose to it, huffed once, then twice, and pushed at its shoulder the way any mother in the world will push at her child when she needs to know that the child is real and still hers. The cub pressed into her chest and made a small, muffled sound that Seth would carry with him the rest of his life. Then the mother lifted her head and she looked at him again. He wasn't a religious man. He had gone to a Baptist church 3 or 4 times as a boy, mostly because his grandfather had made him, and he still knew the words to 2 hymns and could not sit through a third. But when that bear held him with her eyes, he understood for the first time what people meant by the word grace. She had every reason to tear him apart. She had every biological instinct in her body pushing her forward, and she did not use them. She walked toward him. 10 feet. 5. 2. He felt her breath on his face, warm and slow and smelling of pine sap and wet earth, and something that could only be described as animal, not bad, just old, older than any word he had for it. Her nose brushed the line of his jaw. She exhaled once, a long and deliberate breath, as if she were reading him with something more reliable than sight. Then she pressed her muzzle gently against his shoulder. Not hard, not angry, not curious, just present, the way a friend leans against you on a bench when there is nothing to say. He opened his eyes. She held his gaze for a moment that seemed to fold time in on itself. He would try, in later years, to describe what he saw in those dark eyes, and he would always come up short. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. Gratitude was a human word. It was something older, something that lived in a place words had never learned how to reach. It was a decision. She had decided about him, and whatever the decision was, it did not include tearing him apart. She turned. She gathered her cub with a low chuff. She walked back into the pines without looking over her shoulder, and the forest closed behind her as if she had never been there at all. Seth sat on that gravel bar for a long time. He could not have said how long. At some point he realized that his cheeks were wet and that it wasn't river water, and he lifted a hand to his face and touched the wetness and didn't understand it. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried when his father was buried 3 years earlier. He had not cried when Emma was born, though Rachel liked to tell people he had. He had not cried at any point in his adult life that he could remember. And yet here he was, sitting on cold rock in wet clothes, crying like he had been holding it in for 34 years, and someone had finally reached inside him and turned the key. That was where the story would have ended if the world had been kind. It wasn't. He was still shaking when he made it back to his truck. The walk out of Kenner State Forest had taken him almost 2 hours, most of it on autopilot, boots squelching, jaw clamped tight to keep his teeth from rattling out of his head. He got the heater going and sat in the driver's seat and stared through the windshield for a long time, watching the pines shift in a wind he could no longer feel. Then he called Rachel. He did not tell her what had happened. He told her he was on his way home and that he loved her. She laughed and said she loved him too, and that Emma had lost another tooth at school and had questions about the going rate. He drove home the long way. Rockridge, Montana, was the kind of town where every truck at the traffic light knew every other truck at the traffic light. It was tucked into a valley an hour east of the Idaho line, 3,000 people if you counted the outlying ranches, a place that survived on ranching and a little tourism and the state forest that ran up along the western ridge. Seth had been born there. His father had been born there. His grandfather had come up from Wyoming in 1952 to work a timber crew and had never left. There were colliers buried in the cemetery on the hill and colliers in the town records going back to before the state was a state. He knew almost everyone he passed, and almost everyone he passed knew him. He almost told the man at the gas station. He almost told the woman behind the counter at the coffee shop when he stopped to pick up a chocolate croissant for Emma. He didn't. Something in him wanted to hold the thing quietly for a while, wanted to put it under his ribs like a stone and let it settle before he handed it out to be turned over by people who hadn't been there. Rachel was in the kitchen when he came in. She took one look at him and knew. She didn't ask what. She just walked over and put her hand flat against the center of his chest and said, "Talk." So he did. He told her about the sound over the water. He told her about the cold. He told her about the log giving way and the claw marks on his forearm. He pulled up his sleeve, and she made a small, sharp sound and reached for the first aid kit. He told her about the huff at the tree line. And when he got to the part about the breath on his face, he had to stop and put both palms flat on the kitchen counter and breathe like he was learning how. Rachel didn't say anything. She just cleaned the scratches and taped them up, and then held him for a long time without moving. He didn't tell Emma that night. He sat across from her at breakfast the next morning and watched her prod at her cereal with the solemn focus a 9-year-old brings to important business. And he thought about the mother bear pushing her cub with her nose to check if the cub was real, and he felt something in his chest that he could not have named. He went to work that Monday, planning to file a routine report about a wildlife encounter on the Clearwater and go home. That plan lasted about 11 minutes. The video had been up since Saturday night. A hiker on the ridge above the river had had a phone in his pocket. He had heard Seth shout, and he had come running to the edge, and he had filmed everything from the moment Seth broke the surface with the cub in his hands to the moment the mother bear pressed her nose to Seth's jaw and walked away. He had posted it to social media that night, tagged the state, tagged the county, tagged 3 or 4 viral accounts and gone to bed. By Monday morning, the video had been watched 14 million times. Seth's boss, Dan Hollister, was waiting in the parking lot when Seth pulled up. Dan was 58 years old, wide in the shoulders, grey in the mustache, and generally happier when his wardens did not appear on the news. He did not say good morning. He said, "My office, now." Seth followed him inside. He could feel eyes on him from the other wardens. Nobody was smiling. Somebody had put a printout of a frame from the video on the wall of the break room. Seth on one knee on the gravel bar, the mother bear inches from his face, and Seth could tell from the way Dan's neck was red under his collar that he had already seen it and had not been amused. Dan shut the office door. "You want to explain to me," Dan said, "what the hell you were doing in that river without your radio?" Seth started to answer. "Don't." Dan held up a hand. "Don't. I've been up since 5 with the regional office. I've been on the phone with the governor's press secretary. Do you understand what you did? I pulled a cub out of a river. You put yourself between a mother bear and her cub. I know. You had no support, you had no backup, you had no radio. I know." Dan sat down heavily behind his desk. He rubbed a hand across his face and looked at Seth for a long time. And Seth understood, watching him, that Dan was not entirely angry. Dan was scared. Dan had lost a warden to a grisly attack 12 years earlier in the Bitterroot, and Dan had told the story once at a Christmas party when he'd had too much whiskey and had never told it again. Dan had been the one who called that warden's wife. Dan looked at the desk for a while. Then he looked up. "You're on desk duty for 2 weeks," he said. "I don't care that you saved the cub. I don't care that the bear walked away. I care that you had no radio and no partner and no plan. If you died in that river, do you know what I would have had to tell Rachel?" Seth swallowed. "Yes, sir." 2 weeks, and when you come back you're carrying 2 radios." "Yes, sir." Dan paused, then quieter. "That's the wildest thing I've ever seen on video. I want you to know that. It's the wildest thing I've ever seen, and it's the dumbest thing you've ever done. Get out of my office." Seth got out of his office. And that, he thought, walking to his desk, while every warden in the room stared at the floor and pretended not to have been watching him, was the end of the strange part. He was wrong about that too. By Wednesday, there were 3 television trucks parked outside the Rockridge Municipal Building. By Thursday, there were 7. Emma came home from school on Friday with a note from her teacher saying that a reporter had tried to walk into the 3rd grade classroom to ask her about her father. Rachel called the school principal that night. Then she called the town sheriff. Then she poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Seth across the salt shaker for a long time. "They're going to eat us alive," she said. "They'll get tired." "They won't get tired, not with a video like that." He didn't argue. He couldn't. He looked at the salt shaker. That Sunday, a reporter named Karen Whitfield showed up on his porch. She was maybe 40, small, with graying red hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and a canvas jacket that looked like it had been through a couple of winters it wasn't designed for. She was not one of the big network reporters camped out downtown. She had driven up from Bozeman in a battered station wagon, and she carried a spiral notebook the old way. She said her name, and she said, "I don't want to ambush you. I just want to tell you what I found in the archive last night, and then I'll go, whether you talk to me or not." Seth opened the door wider. She sat at his kitchen table. Rachel poured her a cup of coffee. Emma was upstairs and the house was quiet, and Karen laid her notebook on the table and did not open it. "Your father," she said, "was Elias Collier. Everyone called him Eli." "Yes, ma'am. He was a game warden in this region for 31 years. He was. In 1985, he pulled a bear cub out of the Clearwater River in Kenner State Forest during a spring flood. It was reported in the local paper at the time, a small article on page 7. I don't think anyone remembers it. He never talked about it to a reporter after that one time. He said he'd rather forget. Seth stared at her. Rachel had stopped in the middle of pouring her own coffee. Karen said quietly, "You didn't know?" Seth shook his head. He didn't trust his voice. Karen slid a photocopy across the table. It was faded and small. A young man in a warden's jacket, 30 years younger than Seth remembered him, standing on a riverbank with a wet bundle of dark fur clutched to his chest. The bank was recognizable. The bend in the river was recognizable. Seth had grown up hearing his father describe every stone on the Clearwater, and never once had his father said the words save or rescue or cub. Not once. "He kept it from you," Karen said, "for a reason. I don't know what the reason was, but I think what happened to you last week was not the first time this river has done this to a collier. I think you should know that, and I think the town should know it too, but only if you want them to." Seth put the photocopy down carefully. His hand was steadier than he expected. "Let me think about it," he said. Karen nodded. She stood. She left her card on the table and she left, and the moment the door closed behind her, Rachel came around the table and sat in her chair and looked at Seth with her face gone very still. "Sweetheart," Rachel said, "your father saved a bear. My father saved a bear. In the same place. In the same place." They sat there a long time. He went the next morning to see Frank Malone. Frank had been his father's partner for 18 years. He had retired in 2011 and had moved out to a cabin at the north end of the valley with 2 hound dogs and a wood stove and a workshop full of the fly rods he built by hand and gave away to anyone who visited him twice. He was 71 now and thin as a whip. He opened the door before Seth knocked. He had seen the truck coming down his road for a mile. "You'd better come in," Frank said. "I figured you'd be by." Frank had watched the video. Frank had watched it a dozen times. He sat Seth down at his kitchen table and poured him a cup of black coffee and said, "The bear that came at you had a torn left ear." Seth remembered that. He hadn't consciously registered it in the moment, but he remembered it now. The mother's left ear had a notch out of it, a wedge of pink cartilage the size of a thumbnail, and the hair around it grew in a slightly different direction. "I tagged that bear as a cub," Frank said, 21 years ago. Ear tag came out about 6 years back. I've seen her twice since, once from a distance across a meadow, once at a garbage bin outside a ranger station. I know her by the ear. I know her by the way she carries her shoulders. That's the same bear. Seth stared at him. "Her mother," Frank said, "was the bear your father pulled out of the river." "Frank, let me finish, son. Your dad pulled a cub out of the Clearwater in '85. That cub grew up. She had 2 litters that I know of. Her second litter was in '04, and one of those cubs was the bear you met last week. The line of that bear. I don't know how to say this without sounding like an old man. The line of that bear owes your line something. And I think she knew it. I think she smelled him on you." Seth put the coffee down. "Frank," he said, "my father never told me any of this." "Your father never told anyone, not even me, and I asked him 3 times. He said some things weren't for talking. He said if the story got out, hunters would come looking. He said the best thing he could do for that bear and any bear that came after her was to shut his mouth and keep on shutting it. So why are you telling me now?" Frank looked at him with an expression that Seth had never seen on Frank's face before. It was something between apology and grief. "Because the story's out anyway," Frank said. "Because a 14 million view video isn't going back in the bottle. And because there's a man in this state right now who wants that forest turned into a resort. And I think that man is going to use your video against the very thing your father tried to protect. And I need you to be ready for it." The man was Marcus Redding, Chief Executive Officer of North Rim Development, 52 years old, silver at the temples, a handshake like a car door closing. He'd been trying for 4 years to buy a 1,500-acre parcel that ran up against the western edge of Kenner State Forest. And he had been trying for 2 of those years to convince the state legislature to open a corridor through the forest itself for a service road to a proposed luxury lodge on the ridge above the Clearwater. The whole thing had been stalled by an environmental review and by a small but stubborn coalition of local ranchers who didn't want the traffic. And now, suddenly, Marcus Redding had a marketing hook that dropped into his lap, free of charge. The video of the warden and the mother bear was everywhere, and that meant that Kenner was everywhere, and that meant that a resort at Kenner would sell itself. He came to see Seth on a Tuesday. He didn't call ahead. He drove up in a black sport utility vehicle with a driver at the wheel, and he stepped out in a navy overcoat and a smile that Seth had seen on a lot of men over the years and had learned not to trust. Rachel saw him from the window and said, without turning around, "Don't invite him in." Seth met him on the porch. "Mr. Collier," Marcus said, "my name is Marcus Redding. I'd like 10 minutes of your time. I promise not to waste them." "Then say what you came to say, from right there," Marcus laughed easily. He said his line about Kenner. He said his line about the resort. He said his line about tourism jobs and revenue for the county, and how a certain kind of story could really move the needle for a certain kind of project. He talked in short, like a man who had rehearsed his talk in the mirror and had never once been told by anyone that his talk was insulting. Then he said the number. He said he was authorized to offer Seth a paid consulting role on the marketing side of the Northrim Lodge project. He said the compensation was $30,000 a month for a 24-month engagement. He said all Seth would have to do would be to lend his image and his name and, quietly, his approval to a project that was going to happen anyway and would be much smoother if the town saw a collier attached to it. Seth waited until he was finished. "Get off my porch," Seth said. Marcus's smile did not move. That was the part that stayed with Seth later. The smile did not move. "Take a week to think about it," Marcus said. "I'll be back." He was. That week, 3 things happened that changed everything. The first was that Rachel came home from her shift at the library on a Wednesday afternoon and sat on the edge of the bed and said she had to tell him something. "My brother," Rachel said. "Cody, he's working for Northrim." Seth turned slowly. "Since when?" "Since November. He's their lead surveyor on the Kenner Corridor project." "Rachel, I didn't know how to tell you. I found out at Christmas, but you were still in the middle of that poaching case, and every time I tried to bring it up." "Rachel." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. "Cody thinks it's just a job," she said. "He thinks the environmental review is going to kill it anyway. He doesn't know what those men actually plan to do up there. And he doesn't know that I've been ashamed to tell you for 6 months." Seth sat down on the bed next to her. He put his hand on her knee. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I'm not angry with you." "I know." "I'm angry with him." "I know." He was angry with him. Cody had been trouble since he was 15 years old. He had spent his early 20s running down every bad idea in a 50-mile radius. He had been in and out of Rachel's life for a decade, always with his hand halfway out for a loan, always with a story about how this next thing was the one that was going to work out. Seth had loaned him money twice and had refused a third time, and had been the villain in Cody's mouth ever since. That Cody was working for Marcus Redding did not surprise him. That Cody was working for Marcus Redding at this particular moment made his teeth ache. The second thing that happened was that Emma saw the bear. It was a Thursday night. Rachel was asleep. Seth had been reading in the living room. Emma came down the stairs in her pajamas, her hair sticking up on one side, and she stood at the bottom of the stairs and said, in her small, serious voice, "Dad, there's a bear in the yard." Seth stood up so fast the book fell. "Which yard, honey?" "The back one, by the shed." He grabbed the flashlight off the shelf by the door. He told Emma to stay inside and to close the sliding door behind him. He stepped out onto the back patio. The moon was full. He didn't need the flashlight. She was standing at the far corner of the yard, past the swing set Emma had outgrown 3 years ago, past the wooden shed where Seth kept the lawnmower and the tools, with her nose lifted and her ears turned. She was looking at the house. She was looking, if Seth had to guess, at the window of Emma's bedroom on the 2nd floor. He did not move. He knew her ear. He would have known her ear from a mile off. She turned her head slowly and looked at him. For a moment they simply stood there in the moonlight, 40 feet apart, the way they had stood on the gravel bar. Seth felt Emma pressed against the glass of the sliding door behind him, and he felt Rachel's absence upstairs and the sleeping town outside the fence, and he understood with a certainty he could not have explained that he was not in any danger. Not from her. The mother bear looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she huffed once, the same low sound she had made on the gravel bar, and turned and walked out of the yard, past the shed, over the low back fence in a single smooth motion, and into the alley behind the house. He heard her go. He did not hear her come back. Emma opened the sliding door. "Dad." "Yeah, honey." That was the bear from the video. Yeah. How did she know where we live? Seth didn't answer. He sat down on the concrete step of the patio and put his arm around Emma and looked at the corner of the yard for a very long time. The third thing that happened, and the thing that changed everything, happened on Saturday morning at 7:30 a.m. Seth was making pancakes. Rachel was upstairs. Emma was drawing at the kitchen table. He heard the shot the way you hear any rifle shot in a town like Rockridge, distant and flat and specific. And he knew, before he had lowered the spatula, that it had come from up in the tree line behind the house. He grabbed his jacket. He grabbed his sidearm. He told Rachel to keep Emma inside, and he ran. The tree line behind Seth's house rose fast into a swath of pine and aspen that pushed up against the state forest boundary a mile away. Nobody hunted this close in. It wasn't legal, and it wasn't safe. Seth ran on the frost-hard trail his own boots had cut over the years, his breath white, his ribs aching. He heard a second shot. It was closer than the first. He ran harder. He saw the man before the man saw him. He was crouched behind the trunk of a big Douglas fir, sighting downhill along a rifle with a black scope. He was wearing camouflage that did not match anything in the woods that morning. He had a pack on the ground beside him and a coil of nylon rope. 50 yards down the slope, in a clearing, frost had silvered white. The mother bear was standing with her side to the shooter. She had her nose lifted. She had not smelled him yet. Seth put his sidearm on the man and shouted, "Drop the rifle! Drop the rifle now!" The man swung around, and the rifle swung with him, and for a fraction of a second, Seth thought the man was going to point it at him, and Seth understood in a very clean way that he was going to have to shoot him. Then the man saw the badge and the pistol and dropped the rifle onto the pine needles and put his hands up. Down the slope, the mother bear was gone. She had used the shouting to disappear. Seth kept his pistol on the man. He walked forward carefully, face down, on the ground, hands behind your back. The man went down. Seth cuffed him with the pair of cuffs he still carried out of habit even on his weekends. He rolled the man over and shone his flashlight on the man's face. He knew him. Wade Corbett, 44 years old, born and raised in Rockridge, an intermittent hunting guide who had lost his license 3 years earlier for shooting an elk out of season. Wade had a face like a bag of stones and a temper that had gotten him thrown out of 2 bars Seth could think of. He had, at one point, been engaged to Dan Hollister's younger sister, Melinda. They had been married last spring. Wade Corbett was now Dan Hollister's brother-in-law. "Well," Wade said, spitting a piece of pine bark off his lip, "you gonna arrest me for standing in the woods? You fired a rifle within a 1/4 mile of a residential zone. You had a scoped weapon aimed at a sow with a cub. You know what you're going to be arrested for." Wade's eyes went narrow. "You watch yourself, Collier," he said. "Or what, Wade?" Wade smiled. It was a very ugly smile. "You know what?" Wade said. "Or nothing. You just watch yourself." Seth walked him down out of the woods and turned him over to a sheriff's deputy at the bottom of the trail. He filed the report. He wrote it clean. Wade posted bail 2 hours later. And on Monday morning, when Seth showed up at the station, Dan Hollister met him at the front door with a look Seth had never seen on his face before. "Come with me," Dan said. "Dan, come with me, now." They walked together into Dan's office. Dan closed the door. Dan did not sit down. "They found a bear cub carcass in the ravine off Miller's Cut," Dan said. "This morning, someone called it in anonymously. The bullet in the cub matches your rifle." Seth stared at him. "Say that again." "They took your rifle out of the evidence locker where you checked it back in last month. The ballistics tech I called in this morning did a comparison. The bullet in that cub matches the barrel of the rifle assigned to you." "Dan, I have not fired that rifle since October." "I know that." "Then why is my rifle—" "Because somebody set you up, Seth. That's what I'm telling you. Somebody has set you up. And my brother-in-law has just filed a citizen complaint alleging that you have been poaching in Kenner for a year." And it is going to get very hot in here very fast, and I need you to sit down and listen to me." Seth sat down. Dan sat down across from him. "I don't believe it," Dan said. "I've known you 14 years. Your dad and I fished together for 20. I don't believe any of it. But I'm not the only one making the call anymore. The regional office is going to want to see you cleared before you're carrying a badge in front of a camera again. That's the reality, and I need you to help me help you." Seth's ears were ringing. "Wade," Seth said. "Wade did this." "I know. Dan, your brother-in-law tried to shoot a sow with a cub on Saturday, and you know it, and now he's set me up for poaching." "I know." "Then why isn't he in a cell?" "Because he made bail. And because when I picked up my phone at 11 o'clock last night, it was not the sheriff calling. It was Marcus Redding. He wanted to know when you would be, quote, available for a follow-up conversation. And when I asked him what he meant by that, he laughed." They looked at each other. "Dan," Seth said, "how deep does this go?" "I don't know yet, but it goes further than my brother-in-law." Seth was suspended pending investigation the same day. He was told to hand in his badge and his service weapon and to stay off state forest land, pending the internal review. He was told he would be paid in the meantime. He was told by a very apologetic clerk at the regional office who had known his father that this was the worst duty she had done in 18 years and that she was sorry. He drove home. He told Rachel. Rachel cried quietly, the way she cried when she was not sure whether she was more angry or more frightened. Emma understood something was wrong and asked no questions. The next afternoon, a woman in a grey suit knocked on the door and asked if Seth would consider selling his family's small hunting cabin at the eastern edge of Kenner. It had been in the Collier family for 58 years. The woman said she represented a private buyer. She said the offer was well above market. Seth closed the door on her. That night, someone put a message under the windshield wiper of his truck. It said, in block letters on a torn piece of grocery bag paper, "Take the offer." He didn't sleep. He sat on the couch with the lights off and the shotgun across his knees and watched the front window until the sky started to grey at the edges. Rachel came down at 6. She sat next to him. She did not ask about the shotgun. "Seth," she said, "we can leave." "No, we can. We can sell. We can go to Missoula. Emma can start fresh." "No, Rachel." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I know. I just needed you to say it." He looked at her. He had known her since she was 17 years old. He had held her hand in the delivery room. He had watched her bury her mother. And he understood, sitting there in the greying light, that of all the things in his life he had ever loved, she was the one he did not deserve. He kissed her on the forehead. He said thank you without saying the word. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they watched the sky come up over Rockridge together. The next call was from Frank. "Come out to the cabin," Frank said. His voice was different, thinner. "Come out today, son. Don't wait." Seth drove out. Frank was sitting at his kitchen table in a coat, which was strange, because Frank did not normally wear a coat in his own kitchen. He looked smaller than he had 2 weeks earlier. He had one of his fly rods on the table in front of him, half finished, wrapping thread trailing off the end. He gestured for Seth to sit down and pushed a mug of coffee across the wood. "I've got cancer," Frank said. "Pancreatic. Found it 3 months ago. I was going to tell you at the end of the season." Seth couldn't speak. "Don't," Frank said. "Don't do the face. I've had it long enough to get used to it. What I want to tell you is not that." Frank reached under the table. He brought up a small wooden box. He set it in front of Seth. The box was old and dark, oiled 100 times, with a brass clasp Seth had seen his grandfather work with his thumb. "I got this from your father," Frank said, "about a month before the stroke. He said if the day ever came where I thought you needed it, I should give it to you. I've been sitting on it for 3 years. I think today's the day." Seth opened the box. Inside was a small journal. leather cover, hand-stitched, cracked along the spine. Inside the journal, in his grandfather's careful blue ink script, was a record of every bear encounter his grandfather had ever had in Kenner State Forest between 1958 and 1979. There were 19 entries, 3 of them were rescues. The first was a cub caught in a snare trap in the fall of 1961. His grandfather had not shot the cub or the sow. He had cut the snare and had walked away. The last page was in his father's handwriting. March 1985. I pulled a cub out of the Clearwater today. Her mother didn't take my head off. I don't know why. I don't know why any of this is what it is. But I know the woods take care of us if we take care of them, and I don't intend to be the collier who broke that. Some things a man keeps. Below that, in a shakier hand written years later, note to my son, if this ever falls to you, there have always been men who wanted the forest for what they could take out of it. There have always been colliers who stood in the way. Do not be the first collier who didn't. Seth closed the journal very carefully. He put his hand flat over it, palm down, and he stared at the wood of Frank's table for a long time. He wanted me to know, Seth said. He wanted me to know all of it. He wanted you to be ready, son. He didn't want you to know until you needed to. That was his mistake, I think. But it's the mistake we make with the ones we love the most. We try to give them the world without the weight of it, and it doesn't work. It never works. You inherit the weight anyway. Seth looked up. Frank, there's more, isn't there, that you haven't told me? Frank nodded once, slowly. There is, he said. The mayor. Lincoln Pratt? He's got money in Northrim, not a lot. $600,000 5 years ago, structured through a shell company so it doesn't show up on his disclosures. I know because I still have an old friend at the state auditor's office who called me 2 years back when the shell company came across her desk in a routine review. She flagged it and it went nowhere, but she kept a copy. Frank. I have the copy, son. I've had it for 2 years. I never used it. I never thought I would need to, but I think you're going to need it, and I think you're going to need it soon. It's in the box, under the journal. Seth lifted the journal. Under it, folded 3 times, was a photocopy of a series of financial documents linking a limited liability company called Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, to a personal trust account held by one Lincoln A. Pratt, mayor of Rockridge, Montana. Ridgeline Holdings held a $600,000 preferred equity position in Northrim Development. Seth put the photocopy back. Frank, I know. Why didn't... Because 2 years ago, this was corruption. Today, it's the reason your rifle has a bullet in a cub carcass in Miller's Cut, and my old friend Wade Corbett was up in the trees behind your house with a scope. Today, it's the pattern. I'm sorry, Seth. I sat on it because I thought sitting on it was the responsible thing. I was wrong. Take it. Use it however you need to. I've got a few months left, and I don't intend to spend them worrying about a shell company. Seth put both palms flat on the table. Frank, he said, I don't know how to... Don't, Frank said. Don't. Just go do it. He went home. He told Rachel. He told her everything. Rachel sat at the kitchen table with the wooden box in front of her, and she read the journal from the first page to the last page without saying a word. And when she was done, she put her hand flat on the leather cover, and she said, Okay. Okay? Okay. We do this. Rachel, this could... Seth Collier, I know what this could. I've known what this could since the video went up. If we let them run over us on this, we don't get to be the people we tell Emma to be. Do we? No, ma'am. So. They took the documents to Karen Whitfield. Karen looked at them for a long time. She held the photocopy up to the light. She put on the reading glasses she kept on a chain around her neck. She read the whole packet twice. Then she looked up. Do you want a story, Karen said, or do you want a bomb? What's the difference? A story is written for the town paper. A bomb goes to the state investigative desk and to the U.S. Attorney's office simultaneously, and it goes with your name on the record. A story gives you deniability. A bomb gets you protected because everyone in the world is watching. Seth looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at Seth. A bomb, Seth said. Karen closed the folder. She smiled a very small smile that did not touch her eyes. "Give me 48 hours, she said. That night, Emma sat on the edge of Seth's bed while he was tying his boots and asked very quietly, "Are we in trouble, Dad?" Seth stopped tying his boots. He sat down next to her. "A little bit," he said, "but we're not in the kind of trouble you have to worry about, okay?" "Okay." "Emma, I want to tell you something." "Okay." He told her the whole thing. He told it slowly and carefully and without the parts that would give her nightmares, but he told her the shape of it. He told her about the video and about the mother bear and about Marcus Redding and about the man in the woods behind the house. He told her about her grandfather's journal, and he told her about his grandfather's journal before that. He told her that there were people in the world who wanted the forest for what they could take out of it, and there were people who wanted the forest for what it was, and that being the second kind sometimes cost you. Emma listened without moving. When he was done, she said, "Dad." "Yes." "That's the bear I saw in the yard." "Yes." "She came to check on us." Seth swallowed. "Yes," he said. "I think she did." Emma nodded slowly. She looked at her hands. She looked at the wall for a while. Then she said, "Dad, what are we going to do? We're going to tell the truth, and we're going to hold on tight." "Okay." She hugged him. She went to bed. Seth sat on the edge of the mattress with his boots half tied and looked at the closed door for a long time. Karen ran the story on a Thursday. It was, as promised, a bomb. The state investigative desk in Helena ran it above the fold. The U.S. Attorney's office in Missoula announced within 2 hours that it was opening a preliminary review of the Ridgeline Holdings structure. By that afternoon, the FBI had made a call to the governor's chief of staff. By that evening, Marcus Redding had made 3 calls to attorneys and 1 call to a private jet service. Mayor Lincoln Pratt did not answer any of his phones. His press office issued a statement that used the word regrettable 4 times and did not deny a single fact. The Rockridge Town Council called an emergency session on Friday morning. Half the town crowded into the school gymnasium because the council chamber wouldn't hold them. Seth did not go. He stayed home with Emma and Rachel and made pancakes and watched the local news on mute. Frank called around noon. Frank said, in a voice that was thin but pleased, "You should have seen the mayor's face. I hadn't seen a man look that grey since my own diagnosis." Seth laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. The internal investigation on his rifle collapsed within 72 hours. It turned out that the officer who had signed Seth's rifle out of the evidence locker on the day the cub was shot had not been Seth or anyone with legitimate access. It had been someone using a login that had been terminated 6 months earlier and never scrubbed from the system. That login had belonged to a former part-time contractor named Wade Corbett, who had done a 2-month stint in the Forensic Property Annex 3 years back, and apparently had never had his credentials properly revoked. Dan Hollister, when told, sat down at his desk and put his face in his hands, and stayed like that for a full minute. Wade was arrested on Saturday morning. He tried to talk his way out of it at first, then he tried to lawyer up, and then, once he understood the size of what he was standing under, he flipped on Marcus Redding without hesitation. He gave up the meeting in a parking lot in Bozeman, where Marcus's private security consultant had handed him $3,000 in cash and a set of instructions written in a hotel notepad. He gave up the phone number he had used to coordinate with a mid-level Northrim executive who had, in turn, been coordinating with the mayor's office. He gave up the whole thing, Seth was reinstated on Monday. Dan reinstated him personally. He did it in his office with the door closed. He did it standing, badge in one hand and pistol in the other, and he said, "I owe you an apology, and I don't know how to make it big enough, so I'm not going to try. I am, however, going to say that if there is any collier who ever wants my job when I retire in 3 years, I will campaign for them personally. Now put your damn badge on." Seth put his badge on. He walked out of the station into the sunlight. He walked to his truck. He sat down in the driver's seat and he closed his eyes for a moment. He should have known it was not over. That afternoon, Emma disappeared. She had been playing in the backyard with her cat, a small orange animal named Biscuit, who had been a stray 4 winters earlier and had grown up spoiled. Biscuit had climbed the fence, as Biscuit sometimes did, and Emma had gone after her. That was what Rachel put together later from the shoe in the alley and the crayon drawing Emma had left half-finished on the picnic table. Emma had followed Biscuit up the alley, across 2 backyards she wasn't supposed to cross, and into the strip of pine woods that ran up behind Bramble Street toward the state forest boundary a mile away. By the time Rachel realized Emma was not in the yard, an hour had passed. By the time Rachel called Seth, an hour and 10 minutes had passed. By the time Seth got home and understood that his 9-year-old daughter was somewhere in the tree line behind the house, the same tree line where a man had aimed a rifle at a bear 10 days earlier, he was already inside a version of himself he did not fully recognize. He grabbed a coat, he grabbed a flashlight, he grabbed his radio, he grabbed his rifle. He called Dan on the way out the door and called every warden he had, every one. He called the sheriff. He called the local search and rescue team. He called Frank, who was too sick to walk, but who knew the ridge as well as any man alive and could talk 2 dogs into a track from his kitchen table. Within 40 minutes, 30 men and 8 women and 6 dogs were combing the strip of woods between Bramble Street and the state forest boundary. The temperature was dropping. Emma was wearing a light jacket. She had no gloves. She had no hat. She had a pocket full of crayons and a small orange cat who had presumably kept going. The sun went down. Seth was on the western slope when the last of the light bled out of the sky. He had climbed to the boundary line and worked south along it, sweeping his flashlight through the underbrush, calling her name until his voice was raw. He had heard the other search teams calling in the distance. He had heard Dan on the radio, coordinating. He had heard nothing else. He stopped at a small clearing to catch his breath. He turned in a slow circle. He put his face in his hands for a moment. And in that moment, in the quiet between his own breaths, he heard a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was a low huff. Then another, not a cub, an adult. Behind him, off the trail, deep in the brush to his left. He turned very slowly. The mother bear stood in the darker line of the pines about 30 feet off the trail. Her ears were forward. Her nose was lifted. She was not looking at him. She was looking sideways, past him, into the deeper woods. She huffed a 3rd time. Then she took 2 steps into the pines, stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder. Seth understood before his conscious mind caught up. He understood in the part of him that had grown up in these woods and had listened to Frank and had listened to his father and had listened to his grandfather's journal an hour after he'd first read it. He understood what she was telling him to do. He followed her. She led him a 1/4 mile off the trail, moving slowly enough for him to keep up in the dark, stopping every so often to make sure he was still behind her. She led him along the base of the ridge and up a shallow draw he had never taken before. He shone the flashlight ahead of her, and she did not flinch from the light. He knew she was leading him. He knew it without any doubt. She stopped at the edge of a small cutbank above a dry creek bed and made a sound he had never heard her make before. A soft, low grunt, almost like a call. And from a shallow bowl at the base of a fallen tree 10 feet below her, a very small voice said, "Dad?" Seth dropped his rifle. He dropped his flashlight. He half slid, half ran down the cutbank to the fallen tree, and there, tucked into a hollow of dry pine needles between the trunk and the root ball, was Emma. Her hair was in her face. She was shivering. She was clutching Biscuit against her chest with both arms. She looked up at him with the wide, blank eyes of a child who had used up all of her worry and was on the last of her reserve. He grabbed her. He grabbed her and held her against his chest, and he pressed his face into her hair, and he made a sound he could not have described. And Emma clung to him with the whole of her small body, and Biscuit yowled once in protest, and then went limp with resignation. "Dad." "I'm here, honey, I'm here." She stayed. "What?" "The bear. She came up to the tree and she stayed. She didn't hurt me. She stayed until she heard you calling. I heard her breathing, Dad. It sounded just like when you're asleep." Seth looked up. The mother bear was standing at the top of the cutbank. Her outline was black against the last of the sky. He couldn't see her eyes, but he could feel her. He knew where she was looking. "Thank you," he said. He didn't say it loud. He said it in a voice that would not have carried across a kitchen, but she heard him, or she saw him, or she felt him, because she turned her head once and huffed once, and then she stepped back into the pines and was gone. He carried Emma out of the woods on his back. He got her to the truck. Rachel was already at the truck. Rachel took Emma out of his arms and held her the way a mother holds a child who has come back from a place she wasn't supposed to go. And Seth stood at the tailgate with his hands on his knees and cried for the second time in 12 years. The story got out. Of course it did. The search team had watched Seth walk out of the woods with his daughter on his back and no explanation. And the deputies in the woods behind him had seen bear tracks in the dust of the trail. And by the following morning, there was a version of the story circulating that was not quite right, but was close enough. Karen Whitfield called. Seth talked to her. He told her the whole thing, in his own voice, on the record. He told her about his grandfather. He told her about his father. He told her about the bear. He told her that he thought the forest, at its best, was a place that remembered what you'd done in it and could, sometimes, decide to remember for you. That interview ran on a Sunday. It ran unedited. It ran with a picture Karen had taken of Seth on his own porch, in his jacket, with his hand on Emma's shoulder and Rachel standing behind them both. The state legislature killed the North Rim Corridor project the following Tuesday. They killed it by a vote of 43-7. The proposal did not come back to committee. The 250 acres Marcus Redding had been trying to route his service road through were transferred by executive order into the permanent expansion of Kenner State Forest, doubling the size of the protected area on the western ridge. The bill designating the expansion was named the Elias Collier Wilderness Preservation Act, after Seth's father. Seth did not know it was going to be called that until the governor's press secretary phoned him at 7:30 in the morning to ask if the family would consent to the name. Seth put the phone down for a moment. Then he picked it up and said yes. Marcus Redding was indicted on 12 counts. He pleaded to 7. He served 4 years in a federal facility in eastern Washington and paid $22 million in fines and restitution. His company folded before the trial concluded. Lincoln Pratt resigned as mayor 8 days after Karen's story ran. He was disbarred a year later. He moved to a small town in southern Arizona and does not, as far as Seth knows, come back to Montana anymore. Wade Corbett served 18 months and was released on probation. He also does not, as far as Seth knows, come back to Rockridge. Dan Hollister retired 2 years later on schedule. He recommended Seth for his job. Seth took it. Frank Malone died the following spring. He died at home in his own bed, with one of his hound dogs on the floor beside him and Seth in the chair by the window. Frank had refused the hospital. He had said in the last week that he wanted his last view to be the pines. Seth stayed with him through the last night. Frank was mostly asleep. Toward the end, he opened his eyes once and looked at Seth and said in a very small, clear voice, "You did it, son. You did it. Your dad would be proud." Seth said, "So would you, Frank." Frank smiled without moving anything but his mouth. He closed his eyes. He was gone before the sun came up. Frank left Seth his cabin and his fly rods and his 2 hound dogs. He left everything else, his truck, his tools, the small piece of land he had owned on the north end of the valley, to a scholarship fund for children of state game wardens. He had not told Seth about the fund. It was in his will, and it had been in his will for a decade. It was seeded with an amount that took Seth's breath away when the lawyer read the number. Frank had lived a small life. Frank had saved every dollar he ever earned. Frank had apparently been planning this for a very long time. Emma grew. She grew tall and quiet and thoughtful. She read her grandfather's journal when she was 12. She read her great-grandfather's journal when she was 13. She told Seth when she was 14 that she was going to be a wildlife biologist. She told him this in the kitchen over a bowl of oatmeal on a Saturday morning without looking up. He said, "Okay, honey." She looked up at him. She said, "You're not going to talk me out of it." He said, "Honey, I wouldn't dare." She smiled the smile she had had since she was 2 years old, the one that showed the small gap in her front teeth, and she went back to her oatmeal. Rachel worked at the library for another decade. She became the head librarian in 2031. She built a small local history collection that included, among other things, a facsimile of the Collier journals. Seth was not sure how he felt about that at first. Rachel said, "The point of a story is that other people can tell it too, Seth. That's the whole point." He didn't argue. He had long since stopped arguing with her about the important things. The mother bear lived 9 more years. Seth saw her 3 more times over those 9 years, once in a clearing above the clear water in a soft fall light with 2 new cubs at her feet. Once at a distance across a snowfield in winter, when she looked at him for a long moment and then turned away. And once, on the final time, on a spring morning at the edge of the same gravel bar where they had first met. She was older by then. Her ear was still notched. Her muzzle had gone a little grey. She had no cub with her that day, and Seth understood, watching her, that her cubs were grown and gone, and that her time was thinning. She looked at him across the water. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She huffed once. She walked back into the pines. He never saw her again. He was told, 2 years after that, by a young warden he had trained himself, that a large sow with a torn left ear had been found dead of natural causes in a dry wash at the far northern end of Kenner. She had been an old bear. She had lived a long life. She had died with her belly full and her paws intact and no bullet anywhere in her. She had died, in short, exactly the way a bear was supposed to die in a wilderness that had not been taken from her. Seth drove out to Kenner the next morning by himself. He walked the trail down to the Clearwater. He walked it slowly. It was a bright June day. The river was low and clear and running the color of green glass. He walked out onto the gravel bar and he stood on the exact spot where he had lain on his back 13 years earlier, and he looked at the tree line where a mother bear had once stood 40 feet away from him and decided about him. He sat down. He didn't cry this time. He had learned over those 13 years that crying was not the only way to know you had felt something. He sat on the gravel bar and he listened to the water. He watched the light shift on the pines. He thought about his father. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about Frank. He thought about Emma, who was 22 now and finishing her master's degree and would be home in 3 weeks for the summer. He thought about Rachel, who had told him that morning over coffee that she loved him more this year than she had the year before, and he had believed her. He thought about the bear. He thought about the way she had exhaled on his jaw. He thought about the way she had walked toward him and pressed her muzzle to his shoulder and stood there, present, deciding. He thought about the way she had led him through the pines in the dark to a small child under a fallen tree. He thought about the way she had looked back, at the end, from the top of the cutbank, and had held his gaze in the dark for a moment that had said everything without saying anything at all. He thought about what he had told his grandson at Christmas 3 months earlier. Emma had come home with a 2-year-old named Sam. Sam had climbed onto Seth's lap by the fire and had touched the small scar on Seth's forearm, a thin, pale line where the cub's claws had cut him 13 years ago, and had said in his tiny, wondering voice, "Grampy." "What?" Seth had looked down at the small, warm weight of his grandson in his arms and had said, "That, buddy, is a story." He said it out loud, sitting on the gravel bar in the June sun, to the river and the pines, and the memory of a mother bear who had, one cold March morning, chosen not to kill him. That, buddy, is a story. He stayed a long time. He walked back to his truck as the sun tipped over into the afternoon. He drove home. Rachel had made supper. Emma had called from school. Sam had been mailed a small stuffed bear by his great-grandmother earlier that week, and had apparently refused to sleep without it. Seth sat at his kitchen table, and he listened to Rachel tell him these things, and he ate his supper, and he laughed at the right places, and he understood, the way you understand certain things only in the quiet places between other things, that a life is not a single moment. A life is what you build on top of that moment. A life is the years of small choices and small kindnesses and small refusals that follow the moment when a wild thing looks at you and decides you are worth sparing. He had built a life. He had built it well. He had built it with Rachel and with Emma and with Frank and with a father he had thought he knew and a grandfather he had only ever read about in a journal in a wooden box. And he had built it in some very quiet way with a bear. If this story reached you tonight, wherever you are in the world, do this for us. Tell somebody about it. Tell somebody who needs to hear that mercy is not just a human thing, that the world is not just what people do to each other, that there are still on this old planet forests where the wildness looks back at you and decides in your favor. Leave a comment about someone who was merciful to you when they didn't have to be. Hit that like button so more people can find this story. And if you want to hear more like it, more true, quiet stories about people and animals and the kind of grace that changes a life, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting. Some of them are just as strange as this one. Some of them are stranger. We'll see you in the next one.